even in some sense on the south side of the border, like where they're making it, we know just, from being in the game, again, that the Chinese are importing or the Mexicans are importing from the Chinese the chemicals, right? And then they have these super labs where they're making just a ton of meth, and then they transport it up to the border. And so what happens is you have big bulk loads that are coming up towards the border, and then typically, and this would be meth, this would be fentanyl, it was even weed back in the day when weed was still a big thing with the Sinaloans. Those bulk shipments would make their way up to the border inside Mexico, and then they would sit in warehouses, and you would get small distributions sent out accordingly. So, and it was really almost like an Amazon, right? So you have dope sitting in these big warehouses on the Mexico side, and based on the orders they're receiving on the U.S. side, some gets shipped. So, okay, we're going to ship you 10 pounds here, we're going to ship 50 pounds there. So that's kind of how it goes. And when it gets into the U.S., they will walk it in. They will drone it over sometimes. So they'll drone drop. They have catapults that they've used. So They'll catapult it into a kind of a remote area, and they'll have pickup crews on the U.S. side that go grab it.
Like what, from a catapult standpoint, what kind of range?
They would usually launch them in a couple hundred yards. So they'd be on the south side of the line, and they'd catapult it in, and it'd go a few hundred yards in, and generally speaking into open fields and stuff. And then they have a pickup crew waiting because they got real good at knowing where LE was. They have the scouts out, right? So scouts are all watching. They call clear on the south side. They come up and they bring their catapults, or they drone over, or even we had oh my God, the lawnmowers that fly, what the hell are those? Ultralights. They would fly ultralights over with a load on it. Sometimes it was backpackers, so backpackers would just cross over the fence and they would walk it up.
What kind of load size are they droning and catapulting over?
Those are smaller loads, but you got to remember when you're talking like fentanyl powder, fentanyl pills, even meth, smaller cash loads still yields bigger profits than like marijuana, right?
So like a 5-pound load of meth is hundreds of thousands, or is it not?
No, not anymore. But back then, yeah. So it was smaller amounts were getting higher cash value, but now like a pound. I want to say, God, I'm going to get this wrong, but I want to say a pound is right around $10K, something.
Really?
Like that. Yeah.
Damn, it's that cheap?
Yeah.
Wow.
Because they're mass producing.
Yeah, that's wild. All right, so the different elements of how they're getting it. Once the pickup crews, like where do you guys come in, and where are you kind of initially going head to head with cartels and the movement piece, and where are you guys coming into play?
So once it gets into the U.S., that's where we will come into play. That's where Border Patrol, a lot of our partnerships with Border Patrol, we specifically worked with like their board tax squads. We would be out there doing interdictions. So as soon as it gets to the U.S. side, that's where we come in and start. And you work it a lot like you do like undercover dope, right? You have sources of information that'll tell you like, hey, they're bringing a load here or there. We have some electronic surveillance that we use. Sometimes you're working big cases that have wires and stuff, and so you kind of know communications going on. Sometimes it was rudimentary in a sense that we would do basic interceptions of their communication. And this will blow people's mind, but when I say we would intercept their communications, we would grab a scout on a hill and get his radio, right? And so radio is on, he's using it. We snatch him up without him knowing we're there and grab his radio. Scouts' first orders were, typically speaking, they would have to turn the radio off, take the battery out, and throw the pieces separately so that we couldn't get in them. Because if you found the battery, if you found the main part of the radio and put it back together, you would turn it on and it would have a passcode that you had to enter. And if you didn't know the passcode, you couldn't get into it. Or if you entered it wrong too many times, it locked up. So getting an open radio was a big deal. And so if we could get an open radio, a lot of times you could hear their communication. But even if you could hear it now, they're speaking Spanish, obviously, and they have their own code system. So they would talk in code, so you would have to figure out their codes. But a lot of times you'd be able to break through a lot of that and intercept some of those loads coming up using that. So good old source intel, big case stuff where we're working wires, and then intercepts on their radios a lot of times is how we would work those loads.
What's the kind of the protocol for when you're interacting with these guys and you hear, kind of some of these stories about being threatened and kind of the brutality aspect, like what is your guys' method of trying to avoid getting wrapped up into that kind of stuff, or do you? I mean, are you having guys within the interdiction units that you're working with that are on kill lists or targeted by some of these cartel guys? Or
Yeah, the weird thing is, and it's changing, but back then, like the older mafiosos from the Mexican cartels still had rules and still had somewhat of a code that they lived by. And so a lot of times U.S. law enforcement was off limits, right? Because that would bring a lot of heat, and they don't want heat. They know that us interdicting their loads, they know that that's such a small percentage that they factored into their business plan. And so, I mean, when we were most effective at ripping their loads, we were maybe getting 20%, maybe.
Oh, wow.
And
so it's like a churn rate factored into it.
Yeah.
Wow. So the short answer is no, or at least back then. And now it seems like the new crop is kind of less.
Well, now they're more confrontational and more defiant. And so I don't think they still don't openly come at us like that, because it will attract a lot of attention, and they're really running a business, even though it's a violent business. So for the most part, no, you don't find that stuff, but you do. So yeah, when you're running those types of crews, you do spot check your people, right? You're running financials. You may have to do polys or CVS, voice stress tests and stuff like that to keep everybody honest, because their motto is plata or plomo, which is silver or lead. And we've talked to people on the Mexican side that's exactly what has happened to them. They said, hey, we'll give you X amount of money to look the other way. And no, I'm not going to do that. Okay, well, here's pictures of your kids and your wife, and here's where they're at right now, and we're going to kill them unless you answer yes in 30 seconds. So that happens, but we haven't seen that exploited as much on the American side.
To your knowledge, have any guys within your all the different crews you've worked with ever flipped?
Yeah, we arrested, when I was the narc sergeant or lieutenant, we arrested one of our narcs that had we couldn't prove that he specifically flipped because of that, but he was a bad guy, or turned into one.
Yeah.